The Boy from Yesterday. Before we start with Chapter 22, I just want to remind everyone to please leave a rating or a question or a comment wherever you find your podcast. A rating will help us to spread the word about our story and to help share it around the world with people who might enjoy it. And now, Chapter 22, Chesterfield Memorial Park. As cemeteries go, this one was beautiful. The statuary was both old and new. There were some big white mausoleums and statues of angels. There were old and new headstones and various plants and bushes that bloomed in the spring air. The whole place had a timeless quality to it, and one could read headstones that were hundreds of years old, next to plots where the headstones contained dates that were only a few years old. There were so many for such a small town, and it was one of the few places in Chesterfield that was a living testament to the small city's history and its past vibrance when the mills of New England were thriving. Laurel looked around as they entered the old front black wrought-iron gate of the historic cemetery, trying to find something familiar among the many tombstones, seeing all kinds of names and dates, but not finding anything familiar. As she walked along, Tom following, they came to a spot on the far side near a large white stone statue of an angel with a large wingspan, with his arms outstretched to the sky, near a grassy area that was empty of headstones. There were many lights along the main path like street lights, and the full moon gave plenty of light. There was no caretaker on duty in a cemetery in the size of Chesterfield at night, so they made themselves at home looking around, not really knowing what they were looking for. Tom knew the place a little bit. He took in the sight of so many headstones now than at the time that he knew it, although he spotted the area a ways away where his parents were buried, and others that had died of yellow fever. But there were so many stones now, and it was daunting to think of all the people who died and were buried here since his time. He was almost afraid to look around, fearing he might see stones from people he knew as alive and well in his time. Tom looked to his left toward the front gate, just taking a broad survey of the stones and noticing some names on the headstones that he didn't recognize, many of which had birth dates in the early 1900s and death dates in the late 1970s and early 1980s. His heart ran a bit faster seeing so many stones with so many dates that came well after his time, realizing that there were whole lifetimes, many of them in fact, that came between his time and Laurel's, much like the feeling he had at the campus, realizing the buildings that had been built. He felt he was disconnected to the time he came from, until he turned back to his right, walking in an area he thought originally was bare of headstones, then saw one in particular very plainly right in front of him. It was a fairly large, beautiful white stone that was somewhat weathered, but the engraved name and dates were still deep and black. His eyes widened and he gasped what he saw. Philip Hurd, M.D., born January 15, 1840, died February 28, 1912. "Laurel," he called, waving her over to him, but still not taking his eyes off the stone, walking over to feel the letters as if he didn't believe them by just looking at them. "What did you find?" Laurel said as she rushed over. She looked at the stone. "Who's Philip Hurd?" "That's our town doctor," Tom said. "In my time, we only had one in town. Dr. Hurd was him. He was taking care of Sam when I left. That means there must be more around here. Maybe Sam's is here. Laurel, what do we do if we find Sam's? What if this is all that's left of him?" Tom started looking around the area quickly, frantically, checking the names and dates on various stones, all with dates that varied widely. Laurel looked around too. She knew that while this was one way to get some information on what at least happened in the past as they knew it, she wasn't sure if Tom going back home to his time might change things in the future with his intervention. Or did it matter? How were the rules of time travel going to work? Laurel only knew how time travel had worked in certain movies and TV shows, and assumed that at the time they were all fiction. Now that she knew it was possible, as Tom was there with her, she wondered how else the rules of time travel would apply. As much as she wanted to find out something, anything that might help them, she was also anxious about it. She should have been anxious, for what she found next made her stand still, and instantly her throat choked up and she held back tears. only long enough to say quietly, "Tom, I think you should see this." Tom could tell by the sound of her voice that it was something important. Laurel was frozen with her hand to her mouth, blushing with the red heat in her cheeks of trying to suppress tears. Tom followed her to where Laurel was looking, on a stone off to the corner, near a small cluster of other stones in the corner of the cemetery yard. Samuel Oliver Beckins, born February 8th, 1871, died April 28th, 1890. Beloved son. Tom stood frozen as well as the nighttime breeze grew colder. Tom could only stare and breathe. Finally, he shook his head and said, I didn't make it. I didn't save him. Laurel just hugged him as Tom started to weep as well. Then Laurel saw another stone over Tom's shoulder nearby, behind and beside Sam's. She saw its inscription, Thomas Beckins, born April 4th, 1893, died March 8, 1967. She looked around it, pulling away from Tom a bit, as Tom wiped his eyes, wondering why she was pulling away. She saw another stone next to it, James T. Beckins, born 1917, died 1995. And next to that one, Elizabeth Butts Beckins, 1917 to 1997. And another, Oliver Nathan Beckins, 1917 to 1944, hero forever in our hearts. Laurel turned back to the headstone of Sam. She looked closely at it this time, for the date of death seemed to blur, and she could no longer read it. She knew it had said April 24th, 1890, but the letters of the A-P-R-I-L were swirling like sand in the hard stone, and occasionally she made out that they said May, then March, then a long February. "Tom, look," she said as she pointed to the stone with the swirling letters. "What's happening? It's moving!" Tom looked at the letters, squinted, and took a step closer. "How can that be? What is it doing?" Laurel looked up and back around where the other stones were. Only this time the stones weren't there at all, only a deep, thick grass that led to the corner fence of the cemetery yard. "I don't like this," Laurel said. "Something is going on." "What do we do?" Tom said. "I think we better leave. Something is changing, apparently. It must have something to do with the time continuum. We better just get back for now and research more tomorrow about the magic words." "All right," Tom said, this time leading Laurel by the hand out the path back to the front gate and outside the cemetery back toward Marguerite's house. The breeze blew Tom's hair and Laurel's too, which reminded Tom of the time in the transition tunnel. They were both hungry, but the feeling in their pit of their stomachs was something much more. The Boy from Yesterday. Before we start with Chapter 23, just a reminder to please leave a rating and a comment wherever you find your podcasts so that we can share this story with people all over the world. And now, Chapter 23, Worries and Fries. The afternoon that Emily and TJ had seen Laurel and Tom at the library, time had gone by as fast as they made one of their usual walks through town, stopping here and there to pick up items at the drugstore or to window shop, all the while talking about life, as they were prone to do. They ended up at Rocket Diner, as usual, and as Trixie delivered yet another plate of chili cheese fries, their favorite, and Diet Cokes, over which they solved many a problem this past year or so, they had hardly stopped talking since the library, trying to figure out what was bothering them about Laurel's newfound exchange student. "That's another thing that doesn't add up," Laurel said. "The accent. I've met several people from Canada, and they don't sound like this Tom does. He sounds like someone from an old movie or something. You know, like the kind they show in the film department sometimes on campus, those special screenings from the early 30s or something. The little phrases. Those aren't Canadian, I know. They're like the way my great-grandfather used to talk when I was little and I could barely understand a word he said. He died when I was like 10, but I still remember that. I would ask my mom what he meant, and it's like she had to translate what he said from great-grandpa speak. Was he raised by his great-grandparents or something? How weird would that be?" She went on, with TJ only half listening. What if he's an alien? Like, he's trying to speak English, but he got some 100-year-old version of it programmed in his head in his rocket ship on his way to Earth, and he's trying to infiltrate a boring little college town like Chesterfield to learn our ways and report back to the mothership before hundreds of their ships invade us and make us their slaves. Wouldn't that be weird? TJ twisted the ends of his scarf with his fingers just for something to do while he slowly shook his head and pondered. That would be weird, child, you know it. Then under his breath, not like it hadn't been done before. Emily continued, not really noticing TJ's quip. And he kind of acted weird, too. Did you see how he kind of tipped his hat toward Trixie when we were here, when we left? Guys don't tip hats anymore unless they're like James Bond or something, Emily said, twirling the straw in her Diet Coke round and round, causing it to foam up a bit until TJ noticed her doing that and raised an eyebrow at it. You gonna keep doing that? He asked. Emily stopped, but then looked at his face as she daintily grabbed another French fry, dipped it in ketchup, and popped it in her mouth, but continued quickly. What do you think we ought to do? I feel like we should tell Lars and ask her what the frack is going on. What if this Tom guy is some kind of freak? What if he's posing as an exchange student from Canada, but he's really some kind of identity theft expert? You know the money Lars has now. He probably picked up on that whenever or wherever they met. Laurel is nobody's fool, TJ said, eyebrow still cocked in a cautionary tone to Emily. She knows what she's doing. I think she's just horny for him and doesn't care if he came from Canada, the Caribbean, or Kokomo. She likes what she sees. He paused and lowered his voice a little. And girl, I can't say I blame her. But what if he is some kind of freak? It's up to us to tell her everything we've talked about. How he doesn't sound right, how he avoids questions about his supposed hometown in Canada, how we've never even heard of the campus exchange student program. I didn't know ChesU even had one. I mean, how many have you met? I've never met anyone here who wasn't from the whole tri-state area, let alone foreign countries, except for that Swedish guy you had the crush on before you met Peter. No one. Ah, the Swede. Those were the days. Calm down, it was 3 months ago, Emily said, rolling her eyes and motioning for Trixie to bring their check. You've got a point, sweetie, you really do, TJ said, nodding. But we should, do an intervention. Sit that girl down away from Mr. Wonderful and set her straight, so to speak. And what's happening with Christian these days? She's played hostess with the mostest to Mr. Canada Dry over there, but what's been up with him? Exactly, Emily said, nodding that TJ was understanding her. He's got her wrapped around his well-mannered finger so much that I think she's lost sight of what's really important, although I can't figure that whole thing out anyway. I hear you. Girlfriend acts confused, TJ said. Well, then it's up to us to at least ask. How long has she known him? Who else can verify that what Tom says is true is true? Come on, she said as they put down some cash for the check. And I'm not waiting for change. Let Trix keep it. She's busy again with Jimmy over there. They both looked over to see Trixie chatting with Jimmy, who was sitting alone in a booth with a chocolate shake and some book he was reading. Well, well, TJ said, I'm going to have a white waitress for a sister-in-law any day now, methinks, as Jimmy was TJ's brother. You think? Emily asked, cocking her head and crinkling her nose. I saw that coming. Love works in mysterious ways. Tell it, girl, TJ said, holding the door for the diner open gallantly for Emily and following her out. May I remind you, we both have tests to pass. Time to hit the books. We'll deal with Miss Hostess with the Mostest later.